Well, thank you all for coming and welcome to this, our first talk for today's annual forum. It's entitled Transnational Draculas by Professor Ken Gelder, who's joining us all the way from Melbourne, where it is currently 10:15 at night. So we're all really grateful and happy for him to be here. I don't know if we've got any other Australians around. If you do, please say so in the chat. We can form a little Australian crew so he doesn't feel alone. But yeah, no, this is, we're really grateful for Ken for joining us. If you could keep your mics muted throughout the talk until the question portion, that would be great. This will last until 2:15 p.m. British Standard Time, so 1 hour from now. The talk will be about 45 minutes, I think, Ken, is that right? Yeah, with however much time we've got left for questions. I'll be your chair today. I'm Cassie, as Reese introduced me earlier. And if you have any questions for Ken, you can mention them in the chat while he's talking if you like. You can type them in, or of course you can save them for afterwards. We'll collect all your questions no matter when you post them. By default, we'll ask your questions for you if you type them in the chat. But if you would like to speak aloud and say your question directly to Ken, if you can indicate that when you type your question in the chat, then we know to come to you and ask you to speak. You can keep your mics on, your cameras on if you like while Ken's talking, although we may post in the chat if things are getting a little bit laggy, we may ask you to turn your cameras off just for that purpose. And finally, if you like, you can obviously, as we were saying, hashtag MidSpot 2021 on Twitter. If you want to engage, ask questions there or engage with the talk. But apart from all of that, I think that's the housekeeping bit out of the way. I want to launch straight into Ken's talk. So I'll read out Ken's bio for you. If it's all right with you, Ken, I'll do a slightly shortened version. And then if you want to plug any more of your publications or anything else that you do, obviously feel free to do that. But I'll read out your bio and then you can take it away. So Ken Gelder is a professor of English at the University of Melbourne, Australia. His books on aspects of popular culture include Reading the Vampire, New Vampire Cinema, Popular Fiction, The Logics and Practices of a Literary Field. And one that I've personally found really useful lately in my book is Adapting Bestsellers, Fantasy, Franchise, and the Afterlife of Story Worlds. He is also published widely on Australian literature and culture. So yeah, please feel free, Ken, to take it away, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, Cassie. Thanks very much, and hello, everyone. And yeah, it is, it's not that late at night, it's about sort of 10:15 or something here, 20 past, whatever it is, in Melbourne, where I am at the moment, in a city that is in what they call hard lockdown. There's even a curfew here. So I haven't been outside that much. I see actually my evening lighting is not that great, so I probably look a bit bleached and actually probably a bit like an old vampire myself. But anyway, thank you for coming along, and thank you very much to Cassie and everyone for asking me along, just to give this talk. I hope it's going to be interesting. I'm going to just share my screen, if that's okay. We'll see how it goes. Just to put a PowerPoint up. Here we are. Okay, that's good. Now, can everyone see that? Is that all right with everyone?
Yeah. I can, yeah.
I've lost the large, hang on a second, sorry. I'm so sorry, hang on. Just bear with me for a minute. Have to get my paper up as well. So here we are, it's good. I think that's all right. Good, okay, so let me begin. So you can see there on the PowerPoint, I hope, Elizabeth Kostova's best-selling novel, actually her debut novel from 2005 called The Historian. This is in this novel, a young woman accompanies her father in a prolonged search for Dracula's tomb, traveling to Amsterdam, Istanbul, Paris, Athens, Slovenia, and a host of other European locations, actually everywhere it seems except Transylvania. Each section of The Historian of this novel is prefaced with a quote from Stoker's novel, Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula, which drives the quest in this novel to find out where the vampire is now hiding. The Historian entirely depends on Dracula on that novel for its narrative its themes and its atmosphere, and demonstrates its sheer familiarity with that novel and its eponymous anti-hero. But it also wants to show that Dracula has now exceeded Stoker's novel, outlasting it and outpacing it. And of course, Dracula himself has precisely this ambition as he plans his migration from Transylvania to London to become, as he famously tells Jonathan Harker in that novel, a stranger in a strange land, although of course he's not the first person to use that particular phrase. In 1908, 10 years after Stoker's novel, the sociologist Jörg Simmel published an important essay titled The Stranger, Der Fremde, identifying this migrating figure as quintessentially modern. The stranger, as he puts it, is, quote, not the wanderer who comes today and goes tomorrow, but rather the man who comes today and stays tomorrow. This projection into the future of someone who arrives and doesn't leave gives us a good sense of where Dracula is heading after Stoker's novel. So this talk today is going to track the vampire's arrival in three quite different places: the American South, Japan, and Sweden. And it wants to suggest as a general observation that the vampire does indeed turn out to be a stranger in a strange land who's nevertheless also already recognizable and even familiar. To draw on Jörg Simmel's stranger, again, this figure of the stranger in Simmel's essay, the vampire, I'm kind of quoting Simmel here, does not belong even as it makes itself at home. And to quote Simmel again, it indicates that one who is close by is remote, and one who is remote is near. So I feel like a bit of a vampire myself here, really saying that. Let me just try and see if I can move my PowerPoint along. And that means hopefully doing this. Oops. Yeah, is that okay? Can you see the second slide? Oh, no worries, that's good. Okay, yes. So, okay, thank you, Cassie. Thanks, good. Yes, I like the little thumbs up sign you get on your slide. I like that. Very reassuring, that is. So my first question here: when did vampires migrate to America? In Stephanie Meyer's popular Twilight novels, vampires are the cold ones, as she puts it, who arrive in the New World early on and soon outnumber the Quileutes, a Native American community from the northwest coast of the United States, actually in Washington State. Mayer's account of these vampire conquistadors unfolds in Eclipse from 2007 and is presented as if it is an established part of the Quileute legend, with vampires cast there as colonial invaders who bring modernity and death to indigenous populations, remaining in perpetual conflict with them right to the present day, since, like all colonials, they too never go away. In Seth Grahame-Smith's novel, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter from 2010, vampires migrate to the American South in the late 16th century, so well before the time of Dracula, of course, and go on to become slave traders and plantation owners. Abraham Lincoln is horrified by vampires and by slavery, and as he gains political influence, he gathers together a sort of crew of light in that novel to fight against them. In New Orleans, he meets the writer Edgar Allan Poe, who's obsessed with vampires. Poe tells Lincoln that vampires persecuted in Europe fled to America to enjoy its freedoms. They loved its lawlessness, he says, its vastness. They loved its remote villages and its ports brimming with the newly arrived. But more than anything, Lincoln, they loved its slaves. In the 2012 film adaptation of Grahame-Smith's novel, directed by Timur Bekmambetov, Lincoln defeats the slave-trading Confederate vampires in the Civil War, personally killing a powerful vampire plantation owner called Adam in a climactic fight on board a train. In the novel, however, slave revolts play a much larger role in overcoming the vampires. Lincoln loses some of his family to vampires, but at least the novel concludes he had, quote, driven the worst of them out of America. One particularly troublesome vampire remains, however, John Wilkes Booth. Let me just move my slides along again. Okay. The Lacanian critic Slavoj Žižek has noted that Beckman Betov's film, and by implication Graham Smith's novel, are ridiculous in one obvious sense, but revelatory in another, offering a sort of delirious hallucination that literally demonizes the slave trade and Southern secessionism in mid-19th century America. In fact, this particular hallucination has a longer history in vampire fiction, going back at least as far as Anne Rice's vampire Lestat novels. Jason Friedman's talked about Anne Rice's first Lestat novel, Interview with the Vampire, from 1976, a long time ago now, as an example of Plantation Gothic. Plantation Gothic. This description certainly applies to the early part of the narrative, where a young man, Louis, recalls his life as a French Catholic slaveholder in 1791, the owner of an indigo plantation in Louisiana called Pointe du Lac, not far from New Orleans. The slavery system was already deeply unstable by this time, of course. In the year Louis begins his story, around 100,000 slaves had risen up against their owners on the French-owned colony of Saint-Domingue, quote, bringing down 180, I'm quoting just a sort of commentary on this really, bringing down 180 sugar plantations and hundreds of coffee and indigo plantations. That slave revolt in Saint-Domingue aroused the most intense alarm amongst the possessing classes on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm quoting another commentator here. In Interview with the Vampire, in this novel, Louis' brother Paul urges his family to sell all our property in Louisiana, everything we owned, and use the money to do God's work in France. In fact, indigo plantations like Louis' were struggling financially by the 1790s. One of the effects of the slave rebellion in sugar-producing Saint-Domingue was a rise in the number of sugar plantations on the mainland. A neighboring French plantation in this novel by Anne Rice, owned by the Freniers, produces sugar. For the vampire Louis, the South is deliriously attracted to this slave-produced substance. He says, this refined sugar is a poison. It was like the essence of life in New Orleans, so sweet that it can be fatal, and so richly enticing that all other values are forgotten. So in this Plantation Gothic novel, sugar is a bit like blood, bringing both life and death, and the South is addicted to it. Turns out that the vampire Lestat wanted Pointe du Lac for himself. Like Dracula, he aims to acquire property that in this case is tied to the transatlantic slave trade. When he turns Louis into a vampire, Louis realizes that he too is now a kind of slave. He says, that's how vampires increase, through slavery. How else? Later on, Louis leaves New Orleans for Paris rather than Transylvania. It's another novel that kind of avoids Transylvania a bit. Returning to Europe to try to discover the origins of vampires, but without any success. Barbara Eckstein notes that the links to Paris in this novel, Interview with the Vampire, are significant. She writes, that city keeps alive the particular colonial foundations of New Orleans by situating it in the framework of the circum-Atlantic and the Third Coast, that is to say, the Gulf Coast, the territory of French and Spanish colonialism and the slave trade. New Orleans is cast as a city full of new arrivals, migrants of all kinds, as the novel puts it, including slaves and slave traders and vampires. There are so many strangers here that the vampires themselves go unnoticed, or rather, like immigrant African slaves, there's a line in the novel that says, yet unhomogenized and fantastical. Vampires stand out and blend in at the same time. Louis returns to New Orleans at the end of the novel, disillusioned with vampires in Europe, as if New Orleans is now his proper home. I might never leave New Orleans, he finally tells Lestat, although his future in a post-slavery American South now seems almost to be without purpose. The Mississippi-born novelist Charlaine Harris begins the first of her Sookie Stackhouse novels, Dead Until Dark, from 2001, by both acknowledging and distancing herself from Rice's influence. Rice's cosmopolitan New Orleans mixes together racialized immigrant groups of people from Europe and Africa, including vampires. Some are assimilated and some are not in her representation of this in New Orleans. But Harris's novels, on the other hand, are more localized. They're set in a small provincial town in northern Louisiana called Bontemps, Good Times, not far from the actual town of Shreveport in Louisiana. Bontemps makes little space for racial difference. It's kind of quite different to Anne Rice's novel. Speaking about the hotel that she works in as a barmaid, for example, Sookie comments, "Blacks didn't come into Merlot's much." But the question of assimilation, that question of who stands out and who blends in, is now much more significant. When the vampire Bill Compton arrives in town, some local characters are drawn to him, like Sookie, and some are repelled. It appears that Compton is a kind of contradiction, a vampire stranger, and also, it turns out, a local, which means that his arrival is also a return. A Confederate soldier in the Civil War, he had defended Louisiana's right to secede from the Union and remain a slave-owning state. Compton's family is from the Old South, arriving and settling in Louisiana just a few years before the Stackhouses. "My folks were here," he says, "when Bontemps was just a hole in the road at the edge of the frontier." Both the Comptons and the Stackhouses were, it turns out, slave owners. Compton, in fact, returns to Bontemps to claim his inheritance. And Sookie does the same thing after her grandmother is murdered. "It was my house now," she announces proudly. "The house and 20 acres surrounding it were mine, as were the mineral rights." A really interesting claim that on property. No wonder Sookie and Bill Compton are drawn to each other. They take possession of antebellum Southern properties, thus placing themselves at the beginning and the end of white settler domination in the American South. Compton's aspiration to be mainstream, and he wants to mainstream himself, should be understood in precisely these terms as a landowner and Confederate in a secessionist Southern state who now wants to be accepted by Americans at large. Oh, sorry, that's my email. Okay, let me just move on to the next slide. Maybe I should turn my email off. The emphasis on assimilation, or as it's called in this series, mainstreaming, in the series of Sookie Stackhouse novels, that emphasis on mainstreaming or assimilation links them to what's often called post-racialism. That is the view that expressions of racial difference are now beside the point, overtaken by a larger national and communal imperative to be American in this case. Although he was the first black US president, Barack Obama gave significant expression to this post-racial aspiration in his often cited 2004 address to the Democratic National Convention, when he said, "There is not a Black America and a white America and a Latino and Asian America. There is the United States of America." The speech was given just a few months after Alan Ball's television adaptation of Harris's novels. The True Blood series began on HBO. In Harris's novels, a minor Black American character called Lafayette is killed early on. But True Blood, the adaptation, keeps him alive as a major character who energizes the narrative. Harris's novels had also presented a fun-loving white woman called Tara Thornton, a friend of Sookie who only appears occasionally. But True Blood turns this figure into one of its key protagonists, a volatile, disaffected Black American woman. These and other changes to the way racial identities are understood distinguish the True Blood series from Harris's novels and pose a fascinating challenge to those novels' benign post-racial vision. When Tara introduces herself in True Blood in the TV series, she notes that, quote, "she's named after a plantation." Tara is in fact the name of the antebellum mansion in Margaret Mitchell's epic Civil War novel Gone with the Wind, owned and doggedly defended by Mitchell's feisty white Southern heroine, Scarlett O'Hara. No one was going to take Tara away from her, she says, or the novel says. She would hold Tara if she had to break the back of every person on it. It's pretty grim. Okay. In True Blood, on the other hand, Tara doesn't own any property at all, having walked out of her alcoholic mother's makeshift house. Later on, the vampire Franklin kidnaps Tara, takes her to the secessionist king of Mississippi's antebellum mansion, ties her to the bed, and systematically rapes and abuses her. When she finally escapes, running across the property in her white nightdress, she looks just like a runaway slave. In season 2 of True Blood, Tara meets a troubled Black American man called Benedict and falls in love with him. But a rich white woman holds them both under her spell, forcing Benedict to commit a number of crimes on her behalf. Finally released from her cruel influence, Benedict approaches Andy Belfleur, the town's redneck police officer, to confess. He's clutching a knife, although it seems more like a gesture of disarmament than a threat. But Sookie's brother Jason, for people who remember the scene, who's recently undergone some paramilitary training and wants to become a police deputy, thinks that Benedict is about to attack Andy. He draws his gun and shoots the Black American man in the back, killing him. This scene is never mentioned in commentaries on True Blood, but it must surely resonate with American audiences who know only too well that fatal shootings of Black American men by white police officers are commonplace, not least in the American South. 2014 race protests in Ferguson, Missouri, coincided with the last season of True Blood on HBO, that followed the fatal shooting by police of a Black American man, Michael Brown. The Hands Up, Don't Shoot slogan became a defining feature of these protests, coming in the wake of the Black Lives Matter campaign that followed the fatal shooting of George Zimmerman in February 2012 by a white neighborhood watch volunteer in Sanford, Florida. The shooting of Benedict in True Blood addresses the grim fact that white police officers in America shoot and kill a disproportionately high number of Black American men. Oh, there's a microphone there that's on. The event itself complicates the fantasy framework of white vampires in the American South seeking either to secede, like the King of Mississippi, or to assimilate or mainstream, like Bill Compton. There's certainly a clear and urgent challenge to the view that the United States is in some kind of post-racial predicament. And when Tara herself is finally turned into a vampire, she's horrified to realize that she's become the thing she most despises, the very thing that had enslaved her in her previous life. Put to work in Pam's vampire nightclub towards not that far away from the end of her life, she's reprimanded when she tries to assert herself. So I'm basically your slave, she tells her employer, recognizing that, as Tara puts it in that series, the more things change, the more they fucking stay the same. Tara is eventually killed. Towards the end of True Blood, the series refuses to assimilate this representative of enslavement, Black American abjection, and racial difference. And she is conspicuously absent in the closing scene of the series, of the last episode of the series, where the remaining cast sit happily around a table in the sunlight, eating and talking peacefully together in a kind of glowing, but probably, satirical or ironic post-racial gesture of community there, but strangely haunted by those characters like Tara, who are no longer with them. For Nina Auerbach, in a book called Our Vampires, Ourselves, in 1995, vampires are defined primarily by their capacity to assimilate and to adapt to their surroundings. She writes, they blend into the changing cultures they inhabit, but they're not indiscriminate in terms of the destinations that they choose for themselves. She perceptively suggests vampires go where the power is. Nice line, that one. For Auerbach, the United States is thus the most appropriate destination for an ambitious modern vampire. But in fact, vampires have migrated to a range of different places around the world, not just the United States. So I want to look briefly at vampires in Japan, turning our attention to two so-called light novels. Hideyuki Kikuchi's Vampire Hunter D from 1983, and the well-known anime film director Mirumo Oshi's light novel Blood, The Last Vampire, Night of the Beasts from 2000. Both novels are tied to proliferating series across different media in Japan and the Anglophone world. There are around 30 Vampire Hunter D novels so far, as well as spin-off series and prequels. There are also animated films, audio dramas, video games, manga adaptations, and so on. Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust from 2000, globally distributed by the Los Angeles-based Urban Vision Entertainment, is also credited as the first Japanese anime film to be originally recorded in English, with a cast of British and American actors providing the voices. These are texts that take the vampire to Japan and then send this figure back into the Anglophone world. Oshi's novel is transnationally networked in a similar way, a partial adaptation of Hiroyuki Kitakubo's high-quality English language anime film, Blood, the Last Vampire, also from the year 2000, which was shown in Canada and Australia sometime before premiering in Japan, and was in turn adapted as a Hong Kong British-French live-action film by the French director Chris Nail in 2009. A long-running spin-off anime television series called Blood Plus, directed by Junichi Fujisaku, premiered in 2005, followed by Blood Sea from 2011 and Blood Sea, The Last Ark from 2012. English dubs of these series were distributed in the United States, Australia, and elsewhere, and manga adaptations of these series have also been released in English. So these two novels, these two light novels, are just a small, kind of microscopic part, really, of a much larger assemblage of vampire narratives in transnationalized contemporary Japanese media. Kikuchi's novel Vampire Hunter D, you see that's a beautiful cover there on the PowerPoint, is a sort of pastiche, a prolonged tribute to the memory of Dracula, distant in terms of place here, but also in terms of time, since this novel is set a long way into the future, 12,090 AD. And it's dedicated to a local manga artist, Osamu Kishimoto, and also, quote, to the entire cast and crew of Horror of Dracula, that is a British horror film from 1958, starring Christopher Lee as Dracula. Names in this novel are displaced or modified citations. The powerful predatory vampire here is Count Magnus Lee, and his daughter is Lamia, after Lamia, the mythological woman in John Keats's 1819 poem. Events take place around a village named Ransilva, somewhere on a remote frontier, that gives an Eastern calibration to a Western, to the, this Western genre, folding, as someone puts it, folding the samurai and the cowboy together to produce a local subgenre that Wayne Steen and John Edgar Browning have called Zen Gothic. Vampire D himself, or D, is a dhampir, a figure derived from Balkan folklore, that is part vampire, part human, solitary, strikingly beautiful man with great fighting skills. Hired by a young woman to protect her family, D finally kills Count Lee by using a trick taught to him by what he calls the sacred ancestor. It's implied that that sacred ancestor is Dracula himself, although the novel cannot quite bring itself to speak his name. It says at one point, the great vampire, king of kings, and then it sort of stops. Dracula functions as a distant point of origin in Vampire Hunter D, but is also a generative force shown to stimulate and influence events far into the future at the edges of a place that's now barely recognizable as Japan. He literally plays out the role of a stranger in a modern, distant future world. someone who is indeed, to recall Jörg Simmel, both near and remote. And vampire hunter D. Dracula somehow arrives in Japan, remains there, and orchestrates everything that follows in a series of novels and other media-based narratives that show no sign of coming to an end. That's why Stoker's novel here is understood as sacred. On the other hand, Vampire Hunter D creates a landscape that's literally marginal to Japan, or peripheral, that distant frontier space that's cast here in this novel as a sort of weird anomaly. It's as if Dracula arrives in Japan in order to produce a massive cultural displacement, one that sees the residues of Western vampire narratives like that film Horror of Dracula inhabit the very edges of the Far East. Mamoru Oshii's Blood the Last Vampire is much more directly engaged with contemporary Japan. It opens in Tokyo in 1969, where students are protesting against the Vietnam War. A character called Rei Miwa is involved in the protest, but as he runs from the police, he sees a young girl dressed in a blue school uniform kill a large beast with a Japanese sword. Two men in a dark car arrive and quickly whisk her away. Rei's life at home is defined by violence and abuse. When they hear about his involvement in the student riots, his parents forbid him to leave their house. But not long afterwards, a strange man appears in his bedroom and introduces himself as a detective called Hijime Gotuda. Students are being killed, he tells Rei. Their bodies are disappearing. And then later on, he launches into a very long, account of the various means of disposing of corpses and of what he calls things that come back from the grave all around the world. The Slavs had the vampire, he observes. The Russians had the upir. The Greeks had the vrikolakas. Gotuda, this detective, turns out to be an agent from the Vatican. Kind of like crazy, this novel. An inquisitor who is tracking vampires as they migrate from country to country. He's searching in particular for a girl called Saya Otonashi, a vampire-human hybrid who Gotuda thinks is working for a secret Jewish organization who are also hunting vampires around the world. So there she is there on the PowerPoint, little image of Saya's face. She's enrolled as a transfer student at Rei's school, but she also has the reputation of being unapproachable. She speaks Japanese, but she's also fluent in English. Rei says at one point, some might think she's a returnee who's been living overseas. In his commentary on the anime film of Blood the Last Vampire, Neil Baker writes that Saya, quote, remains a cipher of indeterminate provenance. Although she does speak in English, she talks to herself in Japanese and signifies Japan through her high school uniform and samurai sword. In Kitakubu's film, which is set a couple of years before the novel in late 1966, the high school itself is adjacent to the Yokota US Air Base, an actual air base to the west of Tokyo. And B-52 bombers are flying off to Vietnam. Baker regards the film as quoting him, a critique of post-World War II US-Japanese security alliances, although he thinks the film is ambivalent about this alliance and its various risks and benefits to Japan. Saya's task in the film seems to be to keep the vampires that haunt the US airbase from leaving Japan and causing havoc elsewhere, for example, in Vietnam itself, which was occupied by Japan during World War II. For Christopher Bolton, in a really good commentary on this film, Saya thus responds to, quote, the fear of renewed Japanese intervention abroad. As she pulls a vampire away from one of the departing B-52 bombers in that airfield, she thus shuts down, quote, the threat that the monster will escape Japan's shores on America's back, although she also ensures that the bombers are free to go about their deadly work unhindered. So this is certainly an interesting reorientation of Nina Auerbach's notion that vampires go where the power is, or in this case, part vampires. Sayer may be helpful in restraining Japan's imperial ambitions, but both the anime film and the novel raise the question, is she Japanese, or is this essentially an intervention from outside Japan? Neil Baker notes that the film eventually reveals an old photograph of Sayer from somewhere in Europe, dated 1892, just a few years before the publication of Bram Stoker's novel, of course. But Baker also notes that it is, quote, a period when foreign elements were rapidly introduced into traditional Japanese life. Ray and the other students at school think that Sayer's connection to a secret global Jewish organization is reflected through her own strange or stranger identity. Someone exclaims, "She must be a Japanese Jew." "Do we even know she's Japanese?" someone else says. "She looks foreign." So Sayer is indeed an indeterminate figure, simultaneously near and remote, a stranger in a strange land, we could say. She is familiar in some respects, even traditionally Japanese with that samurai sword, but strikingly different in others, enough to make her stand out as a distinctive figure. The novel ends 30 years into the future, that is in the late 1990s, with Ray now married and settled down and working, taking on a normalized role in contemporary Japanese society. Sayer, on the other hand, remains eternally the age of a teenage schoolgirl, quote, a violently beautiful predatory monster who, as the novel suggests right at the end, may or may not be working in Japan's best interests. So this is the last part of the talk, hope that's okay. In John Avid Lindqvist's novel, Let the Right One In, from 2004, a vampire child, Eli, and her guardian, Hakan, who may also be a vampire, arrive in Blackeberg, a suburb in the outer northwest of Stockholm, Sweden. The year is 1981, and Blackeberg is a relatively new place. It's a satellite suburb. Soon it's densely populated, full of new apartment blocks. The novel says, only one thing was missing, a past. Where the 3-storied apartment buildings now stood, there had only been forest before, the novel says. You were beyond the grasp of the mistress of the place. There wasn't even a church. 9,000 inhabitants and no church. That tells you something of how free they were from the ghosts of history and of terror. The novel means this literally. What troubles this suburb is not the ghosts of history at all, but the encounters that are specifically to do with Sweden's position in the modern world. Vampires arrive in Blackeberg at the same time. The novel tells us that, I'm quoting, that a Soviet submarine runs aground outside of Karlskrona, a Swedish naval base. It's a little bit like Japan in blood. The reference here, though, is to a Soviet whiskey-class submarine, which did indeed surface on the Swedish coast near Karlskrona in October 1981, and inflamed a local sense of an immediate Soviet threat that led to increased military spending in Sweden and the establishment of tighter controls over its borders. Sweden, as the novel puts it, would become a changed nation, a violated nation. That was the word that was continually used, violated. Eli and Hakan move into an apartment next door to a boy named Oscar Eriksson, who lives with his divorced mother. Oscar is bullied at school. His nose bleeds easily and he's incontinent. He's an abject figure. He withdraws into a vivid and actually sometimes murderous fantasy life. When he meets Eli, who seems to be around the same age as him, 12 years old, he begins to take an interest in his new neighbors. His mother complains about their noisy arguments. She can hear them. I just have to say, she says, about these new people, what neighbors? Did you hear them? But Oscar's more forgiving and a bit more curious. He listens to the new arrivals through a bedroom wall that's covered with wallpaper depicting a forest meadow. On the other side of the forest, the novel says, there was Eli, This is the closest this novel gets to Transylvania, Transylvania meaning, of course, beyond the forest. Elsewhere, if I can mention another publication in the new vampire cinema book, I've written about the vampire as neighbor, like our vampires are neighbors, in relation to Thomas Alfredson's 2008 film adaptation of Let the Right One In. A drawing in that case on Freud's famous rejection of the Christian imperative to love thy neighbor. Freud writes, not merely is this stranger in general unworthy of my love, like my neighbor's unworthy of my love, I must honestly confess, he goes on, that he has more claim to my hostility, even my hatred. If you ever argued with your neighbors, you would identify with that maybe a little bit. The Vampire Next Door is the subtitle of an important 1997 essay about modern vampires by Jules Zanger, which complains that vampires have now lost their metaphysical and religious features to become, as he puts it, in our concerned awareness for multiculturalism, merely ethnic, like being Sicilian or Jewish. He writes, this new demystified vampire might as well be our next door neighbor, as Dracula, by origin, appearance, caste, and speech, could never pretend to be. But Dracula, actually, as he arrives in London in Bram Stoker's novel, is already the stranger who wants to be neighbourly. It's one of the reasons why he provokes so much hostility amongst Londoners. They hate their neighbours. In any case, the merely ethnic is a signifier that applies as much to Dracula as it does to Eli in this novel, in Let the Right One In. And it only adds to the strangeness of the stranger neighbor vampire, if we can combine those things together, as a migrating figure, welcomed in one way and hated in another. The title of Lindqvist's novel is a command, it's an imperative or an injunction. One must only let the right one into one's home, one's country, like a Soviet submarine or a vampire. The question of issuing an invitation to a stranger thus becomes central to the novel. Who do you let into your home? When Eli appears outside of Oscar's bedroom window, a bit like J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, with whom she has much in common, she tells him, say that I can come in. Later on, Oscar is invited to Eli's apartment next door. Say that I can come in, he says, repeating her earlier request. You can come in, she replies. Later on, as Eli grasps the significance of the need to be invited in, he decides to test Eli as she waits outside his door. Oscar, she says, you have to invite me in. But he wants to see what happens when he doesn't. So she steps into his apartment, and in a few moments, blood begins to flow out of her eyes and her mouth and her skin. You can come in, you can, he tells her in a panic. You're welcome. You are allowed to be here. Earlier in the novel, Hakan, her guardian, ritualistically murders a boy and drains his blood to feed Eli. At the same time, in the novel, police arrest 5 Lebanese men in, quote, the largest drug seizure ever recorded in Sweden. It's another reference to an actual event from October 1981. The two events are tied together in the novel through local gossip and suspicion. So I'm just reading the longer quote on the PowerPoint there. There were speculations that the ritual murderer was also a foreigner. Seemed plausible enough. Weren't blood rituals common in those Arab countries? You heard about that. Brutal people, Iran, Iraq, the Lebanese. But on Monday, the police released a composite sketch of the suspect, a normal Swede, with a ghost-like appearance of vacant gaze. Everyone was in agreement about that. Yes, this is what a murderer looked like. Every man in the western suburbs who resembled the phantom picture was subjected to long, scrutinizing looks. These men went home and looked at themselves in the mirror and saw no resemblance whatsoever. So this interesting passage, very interesting passage, distinguishes locals from foreigners and then undoes that distinction. The murderer turns out to be a normal Swede, and then distinguishes locals from other locals. No resemblance whatsoever. Or rather, it ends by distinguishing locals from vampires, which bring something foreign with them, even when they move in next door. Hakan, it's worth noting, the guardian in this novel, is in fact Swedish, an ex-school teacher from Karlstad. But Eli is more obviously a kind of immigrant, not local, or perhaps not quite local. Thomas Alfredson has noted that he cast the actor Lena Leandersson as Eli in his film because she was born in Sweden but is also of Iranian descent, suggesting, as he puts it, the vampire's foreignness. The difference between the foreign and the local are confused here, of course. In Lingvid's novel, however, Eli's foreignness is differently configured. Oscar recalls a Jewish woman who had visited his school and shown the students photographs of concentration camps during the Holocaust. Excuse me, just for a second. Oscar thinks, Eli was looking a little bit like the people in those pictures, Jewish prisoners in concentration camps during the war in Germany. Later on, police hear Hakan calling out Eli's name and recalling Christ's last words on the cross. They wonder if he was, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. They wonder if Hakan was calling out to God. The Hebrew connotations of Eli's name give us a contemporary impression of Stoker's representation of Dracula as a fin de siècle, end of the century version of the Wandering Jew, and an embodiment of anti-Semitic stereotypes of the Eastern European Jew as a threat to national economies in the West. Olga Litvak captures this sense that this figure seemed, from a Western European perspective in particular, both near and remote, that sense of the Near East or of Eastern Europe. That is a version of Simmel's Stranger. So she writes, for the emancipated Jewries of Western Europe, the invasion of Jewish Eastern Europe was uncanny, not because the Eastern European Jew was entirely alien, but because he was a shade too familiar. But in Let the Right One In the novel, Eli's Jewish connotations are downplayed. She is, we could say, both a shade too familiar and just a shade too alien or foreign. In any case, she doesn't pose a threat to the national economy of Sweden. Unlike Dracula, who buys property in London and accumulates wealth from across Europe, Eli and her guardian Hakan are itinerant renters and seem impoverished. On the other hand, they kill and feed on a number of locals, including a young boy, a helpful man who thinks Eli is malnourished, and a woman, Virginia, who has trouble committing to long-term relationships. At one point in the novel, she thinks, let a person in and he hurts you. Eli in Let the Right One In is a bit like Saya in Blood the Last Vampire. An indeterminate figure, someone who, just like the stranger, makes herself at home but does not belong. She's also sexually indeterminate, although she dresses as a girl. In the novel, Oscar thinks she is a girl early on, but she tells him, I'm nothing, not a child, not old, not a boy, not a girl, nothing. The first half of the novel uses the pronoun she to describe her, and then it switches in the second half to the male pronoun he. Her guardian, Hakan, is in love with Eli and is presented in the novel as a homosexual paedophile on the run from police after locals burned down his house. He disfigures himself with acid when he's about to be discovered after trying to drain someone's blood. Later, Eli kills and feeds on him, but he rises from the dead in the novel and seeks Eli out, tying the young vampire down in an attempt to sodomize him, if I can use the pronoun of the second half of the novel. Anne Bilson has suggested that, quote, sexuality is conspicuous by its absence in Let the Right One In, and she means the film. But this is certainly not true of the novel, where Eli's growing intimacy with Oscar means that Oscar will eventually take Hakan's place as her guardian. Hakan was Eli's guardian and lover, but he also entered into Eli's service, as the novel puts it, a bit like Tara with Pam in True Blood, or Louis with Lestat in Interview with the Vampire. When they travel together, inseparable. Vampire narratives since Dracula have invariably cast the arrival of the stranger vampire as a viral threat to a nation's sense of well-being. As Let the Right One In knows very well, vampire narratives can therefore directly address a nation's anxieties about the arrival of foreigners, immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees, and so on. It tells us that Sweden feels violated when its borders are breached, as if something violently sexual has happened. Oscar feels infected in the novel when Eli kisses him and recognizes to his horror that, quote, I'm going to become a vampire. A transformation we don't see, incidentally, in Alfredson's film adaptation. Later on, before he kisses him again, this is in the second half of the novel, Eli says to Oscar, would you want to become like me? The novel turns locals here into stranger vampires, even as it confuses the differences between them. It presents the vampire's kiss as a violation, but it's also massively liberating and invigorating. The novel says, for a few seconds, Oscar saw through Eli's eyes, and what he saw was himself, only much better, more handsome, stronger than what he thought of himself, seen with love. So this is the dual effect of the arrival of the immigrant who's both welcomed, invited in, and vilified and hated, and regarded as an assault on local and national identities. The immigrant opens borders and secures them at the same time. In, in June 2016, Sweden limited the possibility of asylum seekers from the Middle East, especially it limited the possibility of asylum seekers, especially from the Middle East, gaining residency permits. As the New York Times commented on this, quote, one of the most welcoming countries for refugees has now introduced tough new restrictions on asylum seekers, including rules that would limit the number of people granted permanent residency and make it more difficult for parents to reunite with their children. Of course, this remains a very topical issue, inflected in a different way, of course, during the global pandemic. At the end of Let the Right One In, Eli has rescued Oscar, and they're bonded, with Oscar, like Hakan before him, infected by this strange vampire figure. Oscar leaves home, his mother, and Blackeberg, the suburb, and boards a train on the Stockholm-Karlstad line with, quote, an old-fashioned trunk beside him with Eli hiding inside. So this is, in one sense, actually an act of people smuggling. Karlstad is where Hakan came from. It's west of Stockholm on the way to the North Sea. We remember that Dracula travels west in Stoker's novel as he makes his way to London to become a stranger in a strange land. The train conductor asks Oscar, is someone meeting you at the other end? But no one will meet them, and it will be evening when the train arrives at its destination. Let the Right One In takes permanent residency apart, investing instead in migration, and in the hope that one might be welcomed when one arrives and invited in. That is, the hope that one might be the right one. There is, of course, no suggestion that Oscar and Eli are actually going to leave Sweden, even as they travel west. But this is also consistent with the predicament of the stranger in the modern world as the man who comes today and stays tomorrow. That's the end of my paper. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ken. Amazing. I'm trying to find my clapping reaction, but I might just clap myself so I couldn't find it. Thank you. Amazing paper, like linking lots of different narratives and types of media, but like a curious link between all of them, as you were saying, in terms of immigration and otherness, and the stranger who wants to be let in. I thought we've got about 5 minutes left in the session. We could probably push it to maybe 20 past. Obviously, I know we've got a break advertised from 1/4 past. So obviously if anyone needs to head off and get refreshment, then you can. But if it's all right with you, Ken, we can push it to 20 past. So you've got about 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Okay. So we had some coming in on the chat. So the first one was from David, and that was seconded by Amy. It was about whether you had any thoughts on the New Zealand vampires in What We Do in the Shadows, as there's an interesting presentation of vampire neighbours as comedic figures.
Yeah, I see that question. Look, I'm so sorry to say I haven't seen that film. It's a terrible thing to say. I should be watching all, Antipodean vampire films, and there are a small but not insignificant number of them. So no, I haven't seen that film. Yeah, I gather it's a kind of comedy and so on. I'm a bit selective about sometimes I get a bit sick of vampire films, and actually there's a couple of new vampire films out now which I got to see, but I just haven't seen this one, so I'm not going to be very effective there with an answer. Did
David or Amy, or indeed anyone who's seen What We Do in the Shadows, want to speak about that briefly at all, or ask anything else?
Well, I mean, I just asked the question because it does connect with a lot of what you were saying about the idea of the vampire as a stranger in a strange land. And there's a running joke about the fact that the vampires can never get into nightclubs because they have to be invited in. So I would recommend it because I think it does connect with a lot of what you were talking about the transnational vampire.
No, that's good. Thanks very much. Now I have a look. Is anyone watching Wellington Paranormal? So Wellington is the capital of New Zealand, the bottom of the North Island, and there's a very good television series which you may be able to get in the UK called Wellington Paranormal. About it's not really about vampires, but it's a kind of Ghostbusters thing, but it's some bumbling New Zealand cops being bewildered really by paranormal activity in Wellington, in this kind of New Zealand city. Yeah. Anyway, yes, a slight aside, but no, I'll try and have a look at that film. And I see also a later comment on a girl walks home alone at night, and I still haven't seen that film either. I feel really bad about not having seen too many more contemporary vampire films. I mean to see that film as well. At some point.
Yeah, we also have a question from Natasha who asked about whether we could say transnational Draculas feature in the Star Trek series, especially Star Trek Voyager, whereby the Borg, cybernetic organisms, essentially machine and human hybrids, have an overarching goal to assimilate humankind, quoting resistance is futile. Can a parallel be drawn between novels discussed today and these and other episodes featuring alien enemies?
Well, I mean, the figure of the vampire, is quite adaptable. It's adaptable because it does have this migratory, foreigner thing, and it is always about colonization of one kind or another. I mean, I'm really sorry. I look like someone who doesn't watch any television or anything like that or any films, but I'm not all that familiar with the Star Trek series. I kind of know of the Borg and so on, but the alien enemy is like it's a trope in popular culture that reproduces itself in all sorts of ways, and the vampire is kind of one. I talked a little while ago at some event where there was a lot of interest in zombies, and people wanted to ask about, vampires and zombies the same, and the interest is in vampires seems to have been eclipsed by this interest in zombies, and there's an awful lot of zombie stuff out there. It's actually way more prolific than vampires, and I always have that old Jean Baudrillard distinction in mind between the fatal and the banal. I think that zombies are banal, which means kind of like large scale, and it's all about sameness, while vampires are a bit more singular and a bit more like more kind of intimate with you and stuff like that. So you get a slightly different inflection of the stranger narrative. And actually, stranger intimacy is something you do always get in vampire narratives that you don't get at all with zombie. You can't have any intimacy there, of course. It's really about attacking hordes. And there is a new film which I just saw the trailer of this morning, and I've just forgotten the name of it. It's a really, really good-looking film reviewed in The Guardian, or kind of previewed in The Guardian, that was shown at Cannes not that long ago, that is coming out soon, which looks like it's about two kind of elderly women who invite an old male vampire into their home, and all sorts of crazy things happen. It's supposed to be really good, so I want to see that. But it's quite typical to stage a stranger intimacy series of events in vampire narratives, and maybe the ambition of Star Trek is a bit too, large scale and cosmic for that to happen. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got another question. I think we'll make this one the last question. It may be a short one if the answer is no, but we'll see. Have you watched or seen the Castlevania series and the underlying theme of being drawn to power and places of power throughout, along with the effects it has on vampires and non-vampires?
No, I'd like to know more about that series. No, I haven't. This is terrible. The question time is not going very well here. But no, I haven't seen that. I'm really sorry to say.
I'll end on a question that's then that I was wondering as I was listening to you talk. I think you showed really well how vampires and the idea of Dracula as a vampire and vampires in general are really easy, like adapted to certain causes. But I was wondering if you think that there's an element of vampires, what it is about vampires that maybe lends them to franchising.
Well, the Japanese instances are really good examples of multi-platform franchising of what often begin as light novels, or actually might begin as a kind of one-off anime film. So, Blood the Last Vampire began as a film in the year 2000 when animation began to become really, really, a really refined and finessed craft. And so the film release of Blood the Last Vampire, the film itself is only about 20 minutes long, but the release of the film on DVD had something like about 3 hours of production material and about how that film actually got drawn and put together and so on. That then produced some spin-off novels, and then a whole load of other spin-off TV series, and then video games and computer games and stuff like that. Graphic novels as well. So that like you do get this massive proliferation of material. I think with Let the Right One In, you've got a novel and then a Swedish film and then a remake of that Swedish film in America, a US remake. Sometimes you'll have a film that will, again, like Blood, that can begin as anime and then be turned into a live action remake. It kind of depends. It's some vampire films lend themselves to this, and some don't so much. You made me think a little bit about the Twilight films, adaptations from novels, but I don't think they've. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think there've been that many other media platform adaptations of the Twilight novels. Maybe there has. Maybe someone will know much more about this than me. But sometimes, it's just novel to film or something like that. But in some cases, it can be multi-platform adaptations.
Yeah,
it's really hard to track. They're very hard to track, I must just say, Cassie, to do proper justice to the vast proliferation of multi-platform adaptations in some cases, like in the case of Blood the Last Vampire, is really hard to keep up with all of that stuff.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yes. I think the kind of transmedia environment really doesn't help, especially in the last 20 years or so. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ken, for talking to us. That talk was fascinating, and a real kind of deep dive into the kind of some, like you said, just a few of the ways that vampires reflect strangers and otherness, and particular social and cultural issues around immigration, foreignness, and strangeness. So thank you so much for that, and for your time. It was great.
Thank you for having me.
No, you're welcome. Would you mind do you have any contact details if anyone wanted to ask you any follow-up questions or get in touch? Do you have any details?
Yeah, I'll put my email into the chat.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Kat was saying in the chat about True Blood, one of my favorites as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed that section too.
Yeah. That was a really good series.
Yeah. All right.
Maybe,
yeah, fantastic.
Maybe pre-woke and pre-Me Too, actually. But anyway, okay, that's something else to think about, perhaps. Going back to look at it now is an interesting thing to do, I think. Anyway, okay, thanks everybody. Thank you, Cassie, and thanks everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.